Welcome back, everyone, to Staying, a special video podcast series from Louisiana Now and from the Louisiana Conference. I am your host, Todd Rossnagel. It is great to have you back for another episode of these important conversations that we are having right here inside the United Methodist Church, specifically the Louisiana Conference. Our guest today is Jessica Trahan. She drove over from Lafayette. She is the director of campus ministry at the UL Wesley in Lafayette, University of Louisiana Lafayette. And of course, Van Stinson is joining us as well. He has been joining us for all of the episodes. Jessica, thank you for making the drive over and visiting with us.
Yes.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, y'all.
We wanted to have your perspective because we realized that in the course of this entire conversation, we have been talking about the LGBTQ community, and we haven't actually spoken to someone in that community. And so thank you for
Yes.
your vulnerability and having this conversation and joining us. It's an important voice to have in the midst of this.
Thanks for thinking of it. I think it is important. I think a diversity of voices on any topic and any conversation brings so much value and depth to the direction and where people go. So happy to be here.
So let's start there. What is it like to be spoken about but not invited to the conversation in some respect?
Well, I think it's like, think 12 years old, junior high. Like, nobody likes to be spoken about. Nobody likes people to operate on assumption or to make decisions about you without actually having a conversation, without asking a question and hearing a response.
Yeah.
I work with college students, and they're rascally and hilarious and keep me on my toes, but I don't know if they really know what I believe. I think they make assumptions like people do, but people don't know what you know until they ask a question and hear a response.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I see that as a nice place to operate working with college kids, because I want to be able to welcome whoever we meet, whoever walks in our door. In this setting, I think a lot of assumptions are being made about people that are part of the LGBT community, some operating on stereotype, which we're all guilty of in some way, shape, or form, depending on what group we want to identify as other. But also, there are a lot of commonalities that we are missing the chance to identify because we aren't having conversation, because relationships don't exist. And so I get on a soapbox about building relationships and maintaining relationships and being authentic in those. And I think those sorts of things would do us a wealth of good as a group to be able to understand each other a little bit better.
What is your? I'm going to ask for your story. I mean, we could be here all day.
Yeah, we could.
How does your story kind of intersect with perhaps your faith journey?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in church, and I am so thankful for that. More so now as a 40-something than maybe I was when I was 18.
Sure, I think we all are.
Oh, yeah.
But born and raised in the Catholic Church, actually, and found a church home in the Methodist Church when I lived in Kansas City, going on probably 10 plus years ago. And I would say my story doesn't exist without my faith journey. I mean, it's always been a present part of life. How much I did with that, depending on my age and, acceptance of what was going to be happening next. Like, I didn't always go to church on Sunday. I slept in sometimes during college. Like, that was just
Guilty.
Who among us? Yes.
But as I started growing into early adulthood, I started figuring out who I was and having to make sense of being comfortable in my own skin, which is not easy when you were raised in church, because sometimes that church message is there's something off with you because of who you are. And fighting that was probably part of the hardest part of growing through my 20s. And I was sitting in a Good Friday service by myself in a church I had only visited once or twice. And this sermon, like, literally just shook me. Like, I was bawling like a baby.
Yeah.
And it was one of those God moments that I'm just not going to forget. Like, it was impactful. It was present. And it was me understanding that, like, I was okay, in a non-Catholic church, because that is something you have to make sense of and reconcile. But B, like, who I was okay. And not to write off, like, being able to just do whatever I wanted to do and just live this crazy whatever lifestyle. Like, I have a pretty dull life. I mean, I Candy Crush and I play Wordle, and, like, I like to get to bed early. But ultimately, just, like, I was created to be this child of God. And I might be different, but we all are. We have this weird, unique humanity about us that combines us and also individualizes us. And so I think I'm never going to forget that day, but it was like, okay, I can start living a more authentic life now.
As I hear your story, Van, you and I have been talking about hearing her story and where she is in the United Methodist Church and the history that we've been talking about. We've entitled this series Staying. In some ways, this episode could be called Staying with Patience.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Persevering.
Yeah.
Some might even say. So 50 years ago, in the 1972, when the incompatibility language was sort of added to the discipline, ironically, in my mind, as someone who sort of studied the discipline and lived it, tried to live it, and then now sort of is someone
manager
responsible for managing it. We all wear different hats and
Right.
take different vantage points. But that incompatibility language, following a statement that says all individuals are of sacred worth. The irony of that tension has been so unfortunate. However, watching the course of the evolution of that language that has become, over the decades, more and more punitive, might I even say, from my vantage point, more and more harmful. And I'm not even imagining, from your vantage point and those of your community that you are here representing. And yet, through the successive decades, if any group ever had reason to depart, to disaffiliate, we might even say, or to withdraw, it certainly would have been the LGBTQ community.
Right.
And yet you stayed. And you continue to stay and have no plans of going. I mean, and the irony of that now, with that language in place, to see a group that worked very hard to provide legislative ways in our discipline for you to leave.
Right.
Once again, to be told, and I remember we were there, St. Louis, 2019, we're staying. We're not going anywhere. To now decide, okay, then we'll leave. And oh, by the way, we're gonna challenge the integrity and the credibility of your faith, of your identity, of your interpretation of Scripture, of your belief in Jesus, I can't even begin to imagine, Jess, how that must feel, or how you process all of that.
It's you could be mad and stay mad if you wanted to be mad.
Yeah.
That's a really unhealthy way to operate. You have to choose to shift your perspective and shift the way you navigate your day to day.
Yeah.
It is frustrating. But I think when you're dealing with church people, because gay people grew up in church too, and when you're dealing with people that love Jesus, you don't get to just take that away. And I think that is an amazing testament to folks who have done way more work than I have ever done for creating change. I don't rock the boat. I am a rule follower. I am wired. There's rules. There's ways of doing things. I love spreadsheets. I'm an administrator at heart, which has proven to be exactly what we needed at Wesley in a weird way of things. But to have someone, make statements alluding to, do you really believe in the resurrection? And do you believe in the resurrected Jesus? It's like, how do you ask me that question when I have the Good Friday experience that I had that makes me celebrate Easter? Like, I mean, just
Sure.
that is part of our teaching and our heritage and our DNA.
Yeah.
Not just as, LGBT individuals, but like if you are a lover and follower of Jesus, like that is where you are rooted, period.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that you attack something that is so deep at the core of what Christian belief is. But again, without relationship, without conversation, without a willingness to hear answers to questions you may or may not have, it's easy to live in oblivion, and it's easy to listen to what people who say they know the things are saying. And if you don't know people, you do not have to respond to their hurt and harm because you don't even know about it.
Yeah.
So you've identified yourself as a rule follower.
Yeah.
It's a table full of rule followers. So I would like to ask the question of marriage. If you were to hear of a pastor who his or her own conscience says, I just can't do it. One of our guests here on this series said that they fall in that camp, but they're not leaving the denomination.
Right.
Can you understand how someone might hold that opinion, and is that an opinion that would be okay with you?
I think we have to trust our pastors, even if.
And let me preface my question. I'm sorry. If the rules were to change, because we've established that we're rule followers, if the rules were to change and they were afforded the opportunity to potentially one day perform a same-gender marriage, but they said, I just can't do it. How do you feel about that?
We have to trust our pastors. We are not going to agree on everything. And right now we're fighting about inclusion where LGBT folks are concerned with ordination and marriage. There will be another thing that we can fight about. And this is not to minimize the hurt and harm that exclusion does, because it stinks. I mean, I'm getting married in November in an Episcopal church because a church wedding is important to me.
And you're a rule follower.
And I'm a rule follower. I would never ask. I mean, I do ministry. I have pastor friends. I would never ask one of our friends to potentially jeopardize their livelihood for my wedding ceremony. I would never ask anyone to just jeopardize their beliefs for something that I believe in that they don't. And I think that's where we've lost the ability to have civil discourse and disagreement. Is it's all or nothing. It's 100% agreement or nothing to do with a person. I tell our students all the time, if you want to find people to disagree with, you will find them. And you will casually and carefully eliminate all the people around you until you're on an island by yourself. So we can either start with where we disagree, or we can start where we agree. And not to get on a soapbox, but we tell everybody if the only place we can agree is that we are of sacred worth and children of God, we'll start there. And we'll build our relationships from that point. Yeah. And we're not going to have as much in common with some people as others, but we do have that in common. And if we're talking about sacred worth and we're talking about stuff that is in text that we live by, I mean, that is an easy place to start. I hope people will continue to engage in relationship. For those pastors that can't do a wedding, okay, but can you have conversations with gay folks to at least understand how sacred that covenant is? I don't think everybody's called to marriage, but I believe in the covenant of marriage. I do not take that as something, floating in the wind. Yeah. It's not a decision to be made lightly. And I don't think any pastor would say that they would be necessarily comfortable with just like marrying whoever. I mean, that is part of what I understand. The agreement you make to be an ordained pastor is like you will Like, shepherd your people and marry those folks and preside over those weddings that you see fit and acceptable. Forcing people to do anything against their beliefs gets a little shaky for me. Yeah. And I think you get on a really slippery slope when you start thinking along those lines.
When you establish the common ground, and there would then be perhaps, as you've so eloquently expressed, there could be these polar opposite viewpoints that are still held in the tension of having that common ground.
Yeah.
What does it mean to you to worship, work, reside, and be a part of a church that is a big tent? What is the value in having varied viewpoints, which campus ministry is as varied as it comes?
Yeah. I mean, in a campus ministry context, we could work on being all the same and think and look and believe alike. But I don't think that's day-to-day reality. I don't think that's kingdom of heaven stuff. And so, like, we're fooling ourselves by building these little tribes that are homogenous. You know, like, there's difference all around us. Sometimes people want to fight about diversity, which I haven't quite figured out why. But if we aren't rooted enough in what we know and believe to be able to be in community ministry, service, Sunday morning pew with someone that may think or believe differently, then we need to examine our own belief structure if we are so threatened by someone that might think differently than us. I know I have been in church settings, big and small, with folks who love me and affirm me, but also with folks that may not know quite what to do with me. And that's okay, because that is our context, you know? And I think we need to remember that when we grow and when we stretch and when we learn new things, yes, we are learning about different people, but we are so much more learning about ourselves and what we believe and why we believe that. Additionally, I think if you're going to talk about being able to put yourself in other people's shoes, like, deepening empathy can never be a bad thing. Like, how on earth am I going to be damaged by being able to better see life from someone else's perspective? I don't have to understand. Like, you're never going to be able to stand someone else's point of view. Like, that's impossible. It's like counseling 101. You don't understand. But if we aren't able to shift ourselves a little bit and try to see things a little bit differently, I mean, we're never going to build the relationships that really transform the world around us.
Van, you've spent time at the local church level. I mean, obviously established your role here at the conference office, but hearing Jessica's story and hearing, the genuine hurt that the church has done over the years, how does that play out from both a local church perspective of, they're going to change the book of discipline or potentially change the book of discipline, and then, I'm not going to worry about something that the general church does, but where the rubber meets the road is at the local level.
Well, and listening to Jess share, her story and her perspective, it's easy to think that it's all about the labels.
Right.
But there are human beings behind those labels, both those applying them and those to whom those labels are applied. I think if we ever lose sight of that, I think we're really missing out. And I think that speaks to that relational component that you were talking about. They say all politics is local.
Yeah.
Whether we agree or disagree with things on a general level, eventually it impacts how we relate to one another on a local level. And I want to make sure we hold that in tension, because it's easy to say, well, that's happening all out there or up there. Words matter. Language is important. It represents, I think, a much deeper reality. And it's been so unfortunate as a pastor to see the harm, not to fully grasp it or understand it, because it was not directed at me personally, but to see that to the level that I was able to see it, and have to live in that tension representing an organization and a denomination that was complicit in perpetuating that harm, simply because of the language and the perspective that the church offered. So clergy do live in that tension.
Right.
Many lay people live in that tension. And yet, part of the Wesleyan tradition is about holding that tension while at the same time advocating for what you think is right, good, holy. And I think the misnomer in this is, and it's so unfortunate that there are those out there who are trying to communicate this perspective, that somehow or another, two women wanting to get married in a church, in a Christian church, much less in a United Methodist church, if that were possible, is somehow diminishing marriage. If anything, it's doing as Jesus would say do. It's elevating it to a much higher place. So, I remember as a young pastor, I'll close it. I was an associate on staff at a large church. I was preaching one Sunday, and there was, it was back in the era of sort of don't ask, don't tell, and we were at a just different point at that era, and it was just marriage was starting to become an issue politically, and I remember preaching one Sunday, young associate, stood up there in the pulpit, and there was a politician from some part of the state who had made the front page of the newspaper. And, I preached a sermon that was about marriage. And I said, the biggest threat to marriage, as I see it, is not homosexual monogamy. It's heterosexual infidelity. I should have made that statement. And I was young and not thinking anything. And
say it again, because I think there's probably going to be some folks that want to tweet that.
I know. The biggest threat to marriage is not homosexual monogamy, but it's heterosexual infidelity. And we could say monogamy versus infidelity,
sure.
But simply to celebrate gay marriage, if you want to do that, and somehow as a threat to the institution of marriage, or somehow a threat to monogamy. I mean, the logic behind that is just ridiculous. If anything, we ought to celebrate two people wanting to come together and elevate the covenant of marriage to a point, as you expressed it, which was so beautiful, so authentic, and I think so helpful for a deeper and broader understanding of marriage in general. So thank you for that.
Jessica, we've heard Bishop Harvey say that as churches begin or are in the process of having these conversations, not every church is having these conversations because they're committed to staying. But those who are having these conversations, she has asked that all voices in that process be heard. That could look and feel different at every local context, but if you were to have an opportunity, or what do you think that voice, what do you think would like to be shared from your perspective in those meetings?
I think from my perspective, and
you're just one person.
I am really just one person. But I think the concerns that I have for those conversations regarding disaffiliation is the assumption that folks in my community, and it is a broad community, from both conservative, centrist, and progressive backgrounds.
Sure, right.
Folks in this community, on the whole, aren't running around trying to draw lines and say us and not them. Yeah. I would never, and I don't know if I can emphasize this enough, I would hate for anyone to view me as a person that would like to exclude someone from a church setting, from the reach of God's love. I mean, that's what it feels like to be on the fringe a little bit, is like, you're good enough for a lot of things, but not for these two. And to be on the other side of that line is a very tangible feeling and experience. And to presume that me being in that camp would in some way, shape, or form want to exclude folks who don't 100% agree with my full membership is a little bit blasphemous. And it's extremely hurtful, because us, them is how we got into this mess.
Yeah.
You know, I heard the descriptor of this tent being a broad tent, and some folks want to shift it and just include a different set of people as opposed to widening it and actually include more people. I think people are afraid of what happens when love is expanded. Love given is not love lost. Love given is love multiplied. It seems like very basic math to me. And I think we need to shift our perspective back to being rooted in how are we loving people, and are we loving people well? And if hurt and harm is being caused, I question if it is rooted in love, because love doesn't do that.
Yeah, that question of are we loving people well really resonated just now with me. We've been asking all of our guests where they see hope.
Yeah.
Where do you see hope?
I see hope in the hard conversations. You have to look into people's eyes. You have to shake a hand. You have to hug it out. We are not going to agree on everything. And I hate that this is the straw that is breaking the proverbial camel's back for some churches. But the hope I have is when we have older folks in our communities that can look me in the eye and say, Jess, I don't know how to make sense of this, but I love you, and I have a gay brother, and I just don't know what to do. I mean, we are lifelong learners if we're willing to be. And this man is my folks' age, in his 70s probably. And that speaks volumes to me about how long it takes to relearn and adjust things that we've been rooted in. But there's a willingness to be in relationship, and there's a willingness to acknowledge I may not have it all figured out, or I may not understand everything.
And that's okay.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
There's an energy in the different generations that looks a little bit different, but people are finding their voices, and people are willing to say, like, I love you enough to stand up for you. We see that, you know, in our college students. We see that in our people that we attend church with. We see it in community members that aren't so sure what to think about these church people, but showing up and being present is making a difference because there's a visibility that is accessible. And it's like, maybe these church folks are trying to do some of the things Jesus told us to do. It's hopeful whenever you think about what God's love can do. Like, if we are willing to be transformed by God's love, there is no limit to what we can do in our communities. I mean, I believe that 100%. Like, if we are willing to be transformed as individuals, if we're willing to be that vulnerable and engage in those relationships, God can work through us to do some crazy things. And I'm here for it. And I'm excited about what that can be. And I think we just have to kind of hold on to our hats and see what happens, because we don't know. We don't know God's plans for people. We are saying yes to be instruments of change, instruments of God's love. And what happens, you know, maybe not, we get to see it, but we've got to have faith that there's good on the other side of it.
Can't think of a better way to end this particular episode. Jessica, thank you so much for making the drive and spending time with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, y'all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to you for joining us. If you have a comment or if you would like to leave us some feedback, we encourage you to do so. We thank all of you for continuing to listen to these important conversations that we are having about the United Methodist Church, and specifically the United Methodist Church here in Louisiana. We know it's been, we hope it's been a good thing to hear from some of our local people here inside the Louisiana Conference. So on behalf of Jessica, Van, thanks again for joining us, and have a great day, everyone.